1976. It was an important year in my childhood. Yeah, it was. It's true. It was the year my brother was born, and it stands out to me not just because my brother was born, but because as a child, I realized that the whole country was throwing a giant party to get ready for the addition to our family. It was the bicentennial anniversary of our nation. There were flags everywhere, at least where I lived in Texas. There were all sorts of references on TV to Uncle Sam and to the Stars and Stripes and to our great nation. I think there were some special stamps, and I remember having a USA-themed birthday that year. I think my mom baked a rocket-shaped ship birthday cake that was red, white, and blue with USA down the side of it. The whole country was celebrating, and through my 6-year-old eyes, it was tremendous. It was kind of magical that I got to be a part of these people as I heard the foundational stories of our nation told and retold that year. I was proud to be a part of it, even at 6. I've been curious about nationalism lately. I studied an article in the Journal of Ethnopolitics recently. That's not what y'all do in your free time? Anyway, it analyzed the roots of the kind of destructive nationalism we're currently experiencing around the world. And it claims that destructive nationalism has its beginnings in the kind of softer, gentler, latent nationalism that I experienced that year in 1976, that we all experience much of the time without thinking about it. Latent nationalism isn't unique to the U.S. It works to build up an artificial concept of belonging to something, to the nation, and emphasizes a pride and belonging to that thing. It may emphasize buying from within the nation rather than outside it. It may emphasize the uniqueness of the nation by showing weather maps that stop at its borders on local news stations, and flying flags so that the nation is solidified in common conscience. It actively or passively draws lines around people to reinforce who is in and who is not. In the case of my 1976 self, the latent nationalism existed to make me feel good about belonging to the group of the USA. But nationalism does not exist by itself. It has to be promoted, and its members have to be convinced that they belong to this group. The nation state is not a naturally occurring community. Now, it's usually about right here when a few people might start to think about getting up and walking out of the sermon. I'm not disparaging the United States of America. I'm just asking us to consider for a moment how we are members of this country I love. My bigger question is how that love can turn into an exclusive kind of nationalism that can turn destructive. It feels like destructive nationalism is on the rise globally, doesn't it? Xenophobia here in the US is on the rise. There's Brexit in the UK. There's Erdogan in Turkey. Duterte in the Philippines. There's neo-Nazi revival in Germany. It doesn't seem like we have to look very far to find exclusive nationalist movements finding new life all over the world. The article I mentioned suggests that the latent or seemingly harmless nationalism that helps us define who is in the nation is related to the turn to virulent, destructive nationalism. Because nationalism does not happen naturally and it has to be curated, it waits dormant as we buy our postage stamps and reinforce that we belong to something special, which also means that somebody else does not. The flag waving doesn't mean anything negative per se, but any ideological or economic or institutional or social shock to the system, it activates the latent definitions of who is in and who is out. And the traces that have been drawn in very thin lines, drawn to enforce the idea that the nation exists because someone is not a part of it. Those thin lines, they start to rupture into large fissures. Those shock events might look like the collapse of the Soviet Union, which led to ethnic nationalism in Bosnia and elsewhere, or the global economic crisis of 2008, which has been linked to the collapse of autocracies in the Arab world in 2011, the crisis of the EU, and even the rise of Donald Trump. Shocks to our national system widen the gaps between the perceived us and the perceived them. We usually perceive those gaps as harmless until the shock comes along and threatens us. We like to keep in our foundational myth, for example, that the U.S. was colonized by adventurous European Anglo settlers fleeing religious persecution. But where in that foundational myth do we account for the people who were already here? People that were conquered and terrorized. We like to talk about American ingenuity that led to prosperity. But where in that myth do we talk about how that prosperity was built on the backs of African slaves, people ripped forcefully from their native land? So then our selective latent story comes to roost when a shock threatens other aspects of survival and the lines get thicker and thicker about who is in and who is out, about who is us and about who is them, about who can be seen to validate our story and who must be ignored so that our story doesn't get challenged, until the false construct of nationalism becomes the only real story we understand, and any threat to that latent story must be purged because we don't know how to learn a new story. But the story in Acts and our gospel reminds us this morning that as followers of Jesus, we're constantly on guard against letting those latent stories out there shape us. Our foundational story, it's a different one altogether. The story in Acts, it even catches Peter by surprise. He was accustomed to a story of having lines drawn around the Jewish people. For him to become a follower of Jesus, you had to be Jewish. You had to follow Jewish dietary law. You had to be kosher. But then Peter, he gets gobsmacked by this vision, this dream, which in our story this morning he's repeating to others. And in this dream, there's this big red checkered picnic blanket that comes out of nowhere. And it comes down and it's full of all the animals that he could not eat as a Jewish man. And a voice tells him to eat him anyway. And from that, Peter understood that the story he had learned about the boundaries of who was in and who was out, that they were all wrong. And Peter had to learn a new story. Without even realizing it, Peter had drawn boundaries about who was in and who was out. But then he realized, this God I follow doesn't draw boundaries. Nobody and nothing is outside the love of God. And that is really great news. We have a God who's so generous with love. Everyone, everything is seen. Everyone and everything is loved. Everyone and everything is worthy. God doesn't make junk. And God expects God's people to include that in our foundational story. Generosity is God's fundamental disposition. God's love, it flows into everything and everyone without reservation. God's postage stamp includes everybody and everything. And God's flag represents the love of all. 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 And so the fourth gospel today calls for generosity of love. I give you a new commandment, to love one another. This fundamental disposition of God, which we are called to take on as our story, is to turn outward and to love. You know, transformative generosity, it's never about staying the same. It's never about the status quo. The lesson from Acts today has, for the last couple of decades, been one of the key texts calling the church to include LGBTQ people in the full life of the church. And we're not quite there yet, but we're a lot further than we have been. Generosity is the fundamental disposition of God. It changes things. Breaking down the barriers between Jew and Gentile was a big issue for Peter, and breaking down the barriers between straight and LGBTQ people in the church has been a movement in this age. But the theme, it's timeless. Our fundamental story as followers of Jesus must be generosity of love to all of creation. It's our primary concern. Everything else, it falls from that. I know it's a mess out there. I know you want to mourn for Alabama and for military escalation and for immigration meritocracy and for all other sorts of things. And we should, because love makes no peace with oppression. And we should work for a more just society. But look, we're followers of Jesus, y'all. When you follow Jesus, you don't follow the beat of that drummer out there. We have a different story, even and maybe because the story out there is so different. The church has one purpose, one. And that's to work alongside God for the kingdom of God. We're a love laboratory. We come here together to practice this generosity thing, to try and love each other as best we can. We come here with our latent stories from out there so we can work on letting them go, so we can learn a new story with each other, so we can try to love each other. We come here to practice letting our guard down, to practice seeing as Peter did, even when we don't really want to have eyes to see. that everybody in all creation is clean, even when we'd really rather it not be. We come here to practice being loved because that's not always easy, to let somebody else in. We practice disagreeing in love in this place because it's important that we learn to love each other when we don't agree. We practice moving over when somebody wants to sit in our pew, even though we really don't want somebody else to sit in our pew. But we do it because welcoming the stranger helps us to break down our attempts to go back to that story. And we practice messing up and getting angry and coming back to this table again and again and again, because that's what generous people who love generously do, even though it's really hard. And we practice saying the hard things. You hurt me. I'm sorry. I was wrong. Even when we do it through clenched teeth. Y'all go to some retired clergy meeting. You'll see some people loving each other hard. But we do these things because we practice our story, loving each other, claiming the other's belovedness and God's great generosity. And we need community to do that. You can't practice this stuff alone. Love requires that we turn outward. And in this love lab, we don't always get it right. But that's why it's a lab. We keep on in this experiment and something mysterious happens. We get better at it and we're changed by it. And in this community, we ourselves turn outwards as a community and we go out in the world, and it becomes easier to take this thing that grows here in this laboratory and we infect others out there with it. And the generosity of love spreads. And the thing that starts here in this petri dish, it bursts outside of these walls. And it can't be stopped if we don't get in the way. And it changes the world. Because the story we learn here, it isn't just a story of us as the followers of Christ. It's the story of all creation. It's the story of love incarnate. Do you hear the story? Of course you do, St. Paul's. You're living it. So keep on letting the love lab flourish here. And then go out and infect somebody with a new story.